Hey everybody, hope everybody's doing well and adjusting to our new life as best you can. I'm going to give this a shot today. We'll see how it works, and if it works out well, then we'll make sure we do this for chapter 29, 30, 31, and so on. I know you desperately miss these lectures. Today we're talking about chapter 28, which is the beginning of the Cold War. And the chapter starts out by talking about some of the relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States prior to the Cold War. So we know that in World War One, the Bolsheviks, the communists, overtook the Russian government, or took control of the Russian government during that time. And when they did, they pulled Russia out of the war, meaning that the Germans were able to transfer all of those forces over to the other front, which put immense pressure on the US, the French, and the British. So that's kind of what started it. Then we tried to subvert their government, sorry. Then, right after the war in the United States, we had the May Day bombings and the Red Scare and the Palmer raids, and there was this fear of communism. And then, of course, that continued through the interwar period. But then in World War II, we became allies because we had a common enemy, obviously, Germany. Still, however, we know that during World War II, the US and Britain attacked what we called the soft underbelly, which was North Africa, Sicily, Italy, before finally, only 2.5 years into the war, launching the D-Day invasion. And during that 2.5 years, the Russians were fighting 80% of Nazi forces, and they lost 20 million people. And so they were obviously very upset about that and wondered why the U.S. and Britain didn't do more to take pressure off of the Russians during that. So that second front controversy that we actually talked about in chapter 27 becomes relevant here in terms of starting off the Cold War. In the final months of World War II, both the United States and the Soviet Union were racing across Germany, trying to gain as much territory as possible, because most pretty strongly suspected that these two nations were going to be enemies again once the war ended. And that's, of course, what happened. Germany ends up getting split right down the middle. Eastern and Western Europe are split and allied with different sides. And the traditional world powers, Britain, France, Germany, have all been destroyed by this war. And the two that, of course, emerge into this vacuum now are the United States and the Soviet Union. What happens then in the years to come is this false understanding or suspicion of what the other side is thinking or doing. So from the U.S. side, our allies had just learned this lesson of appeasement. We knew that we didn't stop Hitler early when something might have been able to be done before he grew too big and too powerful. And so that lesson of appeasement was very heavy on the minds of American leaders. And what that meant was that they did everything they could to oppose any Soviet expansion, because they thought if they allowed any expansion at all in anywhere in the world to occur, that it would only encourage more expansion by the Soviet Union, and then of course they would grow and grow and grow. So we were going to stop any expansion whatsoever. However, that directly conflicted with what the Soviets were thinking as a result. So this red graph here shows the Soviet losses during World War II. And so obviously they had lost a lot more than any other country. And so their idea was that they had to create this giant buffer around the Russian motherland to protect it. And so they were going to try to expand everywhere they could, but to the US, any expansion at all meant the Soviet Union was the same as Hitler and had to be stopped. And so those conflicting understandings laid the groundwork for this intense Cold War that's going to happen over the next 45 years. And the U.S. thought that if any nation fell, that then the nations around it would fall. And that became known as the domino theory. These pictures here, if you're following along on the PowerPoint, or if you go back and look on your own, show some of the devastation of Europe. You get an idea of why Germany, France, and Britain were not big players on the world stage anymore, why it was just the U.S. and the Soviet Union left. And so what we see then for the next 45 years is this competition between the two. We get the bomb, they get the bomb. Then they get into space, so we got to go into space. They have more bombers, so we need more bombers. They have more missiles, so we need more missiles. And this idea of these two nations continually just trying to find new technological innovations of ways to destroy each other and outdo the other side. And that creates this race to space, the race for the atomic edge, the bomber gaps, the missile gaps. Eventually, this term called mutually assured destruction arises because both sides have amassed so many weapons that if one side shoots and the other side shoots back, the entire planet Earth will die in a nuclear holocaust as the dust rises into the atmosphere and blots out the sun and kills all plant life off. So these really horrifying scenarios that came around. And then, and this is later on, we'll get more into this in chapters 32, 33, but this idea of first strike weapons, that now we need to develop weapons that we can shoot them and knock them out before they can fire back. And then we need anti-first strike weapons that we can shoot down their missiles before they can retaliate and shoot their missiles. So all of this develops over the next 45 years. You guys may have been over to Vernon Hills High School at some point and noticed that their campus looks a little different, particularly the athletic fields built behind the school. And that's because that area was once a Nike Ajax missile site. These were in the ground all around Chicago. There was a ring of them built around the city, and these would be fired up into the air to try and knock down incoming Soviet ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And these were planted around big American industrial cities during the Cold War. In Europe, we see these first conflicts start to emerge between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. In 1947, there is a fear that Greece and Turkey are going to fall to communism. There are communist uprisings in those countries. So President Truman issues $400 million in economic and military aid. That becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. And that, again, is to prevent Greece and Turkey from falling, because if they fall, their neighbors will fall, and then we'll start to see those dominoes go. The next year, we have the Marshall Plan put in place. The Marshall Plan is $13 billion in economic aid to Western Europe. That was put into place because it was feared in 1948 that Italy and France were on the verge of electing socialist majorities in their government. And of course, we had to prevent that from happening. So we thought the best way to do that was by improving their economy. And then in 1948, 1949, the really big one in Europe, the Berlin Blockade. Now, this is a little tough to understand. You can take a look at this map on your own if you want. But as I talked about in the book, Germany was divided into 4 zones of control: the U.S., Britain, France, and the Soviet Union. But the tricky part here is that even though there's these 4 zones, then there's Berlin, which was the capital city. Berlin, even though it is dead in the middle of the Soviet zone of control, was also divided into 4 zones. So the U.S., Britain, and France had this little tiny outpost of democracy and capitalism inside the Soviet zone of control, and that drove Stalin absolutely crazy. And so in 1948, he decided to cut off the roads and the railways into West Berlin. He essentially laid siege to the city. He wasn't going to allow them to have food or fuel or medicine, and just starve them out. And so Truman's really stuck here. What's he going to do? If he allows West Berlin to fall, he gives the Soviet Union a victory. He allows them to expand. Now they're going to keep expanding. That's the lesson of appeasement. We can't let it happen. Option 2, let's ram a tank brigade through the blockade and force food and fuel into West Berlin. But that probably starts World War III. That's not so great either. So what Truman does is he starts something called the Berlin Airlift, which is really incredible if you think about it. 200,000 flights, averaging over 500 every single day, flying in transport ships, planes, to West Berlin to provide the city with food. And eventually, after a year of this, Stalin finally realized the futility of the blockade and gave up. The last one here, the Point 4 program, which was economic aid generally to third world countries. And this was an attempt by the United States to try and buy the loyalty of countries in Africa, Central, South America, Asia, etc. This map really gives you an idea of how the world was broken up during this era. You can see the blue countries. These are NATO or NATO-associated countries. And then the red are the ones that fell under the Warsaw Pact or control of the Soviet Union. And so the divide of the world basically between red and blue. And you can see some gray countries. These were called non-aligned countries. These were countries who didn't join either side during the Cold War officially. Then as we get a little bit deeper into the 1940s, we have China. The nationalists who were supported by the Americans and the communists had been fighting a civil war in China going all the way back to the 1920s. But in 1949, 4 years after World War II ended, the communists won the Chinese Civil War. And so China went red. So China, one of the biggest nations in the world, became a communist government under the leadership of Mao Zedong. And that really freaked people out. The U.S.'s response was kind of like the Stimson Doctrine, if you remember that from last unit, where we just didn't recognize Japanese expansion. We just decided to not recognize that the communists were in control of China. Of course, they still were. The nationalists, those rebels or those Chinese fighters that were allied with the United States, retreated to this tiny island of Taiwan off the coast of China. They are still there today, and we still help protect them. Congress passed something called the Formosa Resolution, and to this day, we sail our Navy in between mainland China and Taiwan, and we help provide the Taiwanese people with millions of dollars of economic aid and weapons to protect themselves, because China still considers Taiwan to be part of their country, even though that's where the nationalists are to this day still hanging out. And as I said, 1949 was a pretty bad year. We lose China. China goes red, and that is also the same year that the Soviets detonated their first atomic bomb. So both of those were pretty big victories for communism in the world in that year. The final event of chapter 28 is the Korean War. The easiest way to explain it is actually this GIF that's running here in the background. After World War II, the country was split at the 38th parallel. Then North Korea invaded. We counterattacked. China got involved. And then a stalemate. And the line is almost the same as where it started. There's a very, very little change. And that happened after 4 years of fighting. 50,000 Americans died. The border didn't change very much. But North Korea had tried to conquer South Korea, was almost successful in that invasion. If you look how bad they pushed the South Koreans back, but then we got involved. When we got involved and approached the border with China near the Yalu River, that freaked the Chinese out because, of course, we had supported the nationalists. This was only 1 year after the Chinese Civil War had ended, so the Chinese got freaked out. They sent in hundreds of thousands of troops, which pushed the Americans back, and then after this bloody stalemate, the war basically ends where it started. And of course, the only thing in between there that we should add is that when China invaded and pushed the Americans back, MacArthur argued to start using atomic weapons, and Truman didn't want to do that. MacArthur criticized him, and Truman fired him, and so that caused a lot of controversy as well. But that's it. Again, hope everybody's doing well, and hope this all worked out. Have a good day.